All right, so Codex and Gemini 3.6 Flash are both claiming the top spot for AI coding right now. And I wanted to actually find out which one holds up. Gemini's context window is 1,048,576 tokens, and Codex caps at 400,000 on the surface most developers actually use. Both tools dropped major updates recently, so the stakes are real if you're picking one for your dev workflow right now. I ran them across 4 real tests: code generation, API pricing, context window, and IDE integration, and every number here traces back to a sourced fact with no vendor marketing taken at face value. And honestly, the tool that wins on raw pricing isn't necessarily the one that saves you money when you're literally hammering it with a real mono repo. Which one actually holds up when the code base gets big? That answer might surprise you. So this one's for developers who are actually deciding where to spend their budget right now, whether you're solo building a side project or on a team dealing with a real mono repo. Because picking the wrong tool means either hitting context limits mid-session, paying way more per token than you expected, or losing hours to an IDE workflow that just doesn't fit how you actually work. Test 1 is code generation and bug fixing. And the brutal thing about getting this wrong is you hand the model a broken function, it comes back with something that looks right, you ship it, and it breaks in prod because the model never actually ran the code. And that's what costs you hours, not the prompt. So let's see how both tools actually handle it. So I looked at what's actually published here, and Codex has a 70.2% pass rate at 100 attempts, and 37% on the first try, community reported from OpenAI's own blog. And what surprised me is Gemini 3.6 Flash has no equivalent pass rate number published at all, though it does have a roughly 65% token reduction on agentic coding tasks, which is a totally different metric, so you can't really compare them directly. I want to be honest before we call anything here. Codex's numbers come from its own blog sources, and Gemini's efficiency claim is from a different benchmark setup entirely. And yeah, one developer reported Codex fixed a 50-line bug first try while Gemini hallucinated a method that didn't exist. But that's one anecdote and not a controlled study, so take all of this with a grain of salt. So this one's a tie, and I was honestly expecting Codex to pull ahead on the raw numbers alone. But because Gemini 3.6 Flash never published a comparable pass rate figure, you just can't crown a winner here. So the scoreboard stays flat: Codex 0, Gemini 3.6 Flash 0, one tied, and no winner on code generation until someone runs a real side-by-side test. Test 2 is API pricing and free tier access. And the painful thing here is when you're 3 months into a project and your monthly bill is double what you projected because you didn't read the fine print on the tier structure. And Codex has 3 model tiers, rolling 5-hour usage windows, and subscription caps, which is a lot of moving parts when you're trying to estimate what a team of 5 is actually going to spend. When I dug into the numbers, Gemini 3.6 Flash runs $1.50 per million input tokens and $7.50 per million output at standard rates. Codex's Luna tier undercuts that on input at roughly $1 per million. But Luna's output is $6 per million, so it's pretty close. And the real gap is Gemini's /Flex tier at 75 cents input and $3.75 output, which is 50% off standard with nothing like it published on the Codex side. Now, the nuance is real here because Codex Luna actually undercuts Gemini on input tokens. So if you're input heavy and running the cheapest tier, Codex is genuinely competitive, but the gap opens up on output costs and on async bulk work where Gemini's batch pricing has no equivalent. And honestly, it's not a blowout. It really depends on your token mix and how you're running jobs. Gemini 3.6 Flash takes this one, and I was expecting Codex's subscription bundling to make it cheaper overall. But when you actually run the numbers on mid and high tiers plus async workloads, Gemini's pricing is cleaner and more accessible, especially with no credit card needed for the free tier. So that puts the score at Codex 0, Gemini 3.6, Flash 1, one still tied. Test 3 is context window for large code bases. And what makes this one really annoying in practice is you're mid-session on a mono repo, you fed it a bunch of files, and the model just starts auto-compacting without telling you clearly, so context gets silently dropped. The model loses track of earlier decisions, and your refactor starts introducing bugs because it forgot what it already changed. Gemini 3.6 Flash has a confirmed 1,048,576 token context window straight from Google's model specs, while Codex CLI and app cap at 400,000 tokens and community reports say it auto-compacts at around 387,000, which is exactly where a mid-sized monorepo starts to overflow. And yeah, the Codex API via Responses API can hit 1 million tokens too, but that's not how most developers are actually running it day to day. The caveat worth knowing is that if you access Codex directly through the Responses API, you can actually get 1 million tokens, same as Gemini. So the gap is really a surface level decision by OpenAI and not a model capability limit. And if you're comfortable going API direct, this test gets a lot closer. But if you're using the CLI or the app, which most people are, the 2.5 times difference is totally real. Gemini 3.6 Flash wins this one pretty clearly, because I was expecting the API parity point to soften the result more. But for the way most developers actually use these tools, a 400K CLI cap that starts compacting at 387,000 is a real problem on any serious model repo. So the scoreboard now reads Codex 0, Gemini 3.6 Flash 2, 1 tied, 2 straight for Gemini. Test 4 is IDE and tool integration, and the real cost of getting this wrong is context switching. Because if your AI tool isn't living inside the editor you already use, you're copying code in and out of a browser tab all day and losing flow state constantly. And that kind of friction is what makes you stop using a tool entirely within a week. What surprised me here is how different the two tools are in their integration philosophy. Codex is natively built into JetBrains from version 2025-30 with model switching and auth options baked in, plus an open source CLI you can actually inspect. While Gemini 3.6 Flash has no native IDE plugin documented at all, but its API level tooling is way more extensive with function calling, Google search grounding, URL context, and structured outputs. So two very different approaches. This one's a tie, and honestly, I was expecting Codex to win it outright given the JetBrains integration, but Gemini's API level features like search grounding and URL context are genuinely strong for pipeline builders. So neither one dominates across the board, and the running score stays at Codex 0. Gemini 3.6 Flash 2 now 2 tied, which really comes down to where you work. So here's where Codex clearly pulls ahead. Native JetBrains integration from version 2025.3 with model switching is real and documented. While Gemini has nothing equivalent, the open source CLI means you can actually audit and customize it. And Codex's iterative self-correction loop, where it runs the code it writes and refines until tests pass, is baked into the product design in a way Gemini doesn't match. And here's where Gemini 3.6 Flash is just better. The 1 million token context window is 2.5 times the Codex CLI cap, and that's the difference between finishing a monorepo session and getting auto-compacted mid-refactor. The batch flex pricing at 75 cents per million input tokens has no Codex equivalent. And the free tier via Google AI Studio needs no credit card, which is way more accessible for prototyping. Honestly, I was expecting this to be closer overall, but Gemini 3.6 Flash wins on the two most concrete dimensions, context and pricing, by real margins. So here's the decision rule. If you live in JetBrains or want an open source CLI you can inspect and customize, go Codex. But if you're building API pipelines, working with large code bases, or doing high volume async work where batch pricing matters, Gemini 3.6 Flash is the cleaner choice.